She was the most powerful woman in the room, and the most helpless mother in the world. Ariana Vaughn had closed deals that made grown men sweat through their suits. She had rebuilt a company from the edge of bankruptcy after burying her husband. She had done all of it without flinching. But tonight, her 7-year-old daughter was crouched on the floor of the executive penthouse, hurling a crystal paperweight at the wall while 3 trained professionals stood outside the door, afraid to go in. Nobody could reach Isla Vaughn. Not the child psychologists, not the elite nannies, not the security team that had signed NDAs thicker than most people's life savings. Nobody, until a maintenance worker on the wrong floor changed everything. Well, if this story already has you hooked, you're exactly where you belong. Subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss a story like this one, because we drop new ones every week. And trust me, you do not want to be late. Hit that like button if you're already feeling something, and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I read every single one, and it blows my mind every time how far these stories travel. Now settle in, because this one is going to take you somewhere real. The penthouse on the 42nd floor of the Vaughn Tower had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city like a postcard nobody ever sent. At night, the skyline was something out of a dream, all amber and silver, the kind of view that cost more per square foot than most people earned in a year. But inside, behind the glass, there was nothing dreamy about it. There was a child screaming, not crying, screaming, the kind that came from somewhere deep in the chest, from a place that had nothing to do with wanting a toy or throwing a tantrum over bedtime. This was grief that had nowhere to go, pouring out of a 7-year-old body that was too small to hold it. Isla Vaughn had been this way for almost 8 months. It started the morning after the crash, after the phone call that came at 4 in the morning, after the 2 men in dark suits showed up at the door looking at Ariana with expressions she had never forgotten and would never be able to describe to anyone who hadn't seen it themselves. Her husband, Daniel, had been on a charter flight back from a product summit in Vancouver. The weather had been bad. The pilot had made a call he shouldn't have made. And then Daniel Vaughn was gone, and the world kept spinning like it had no idea what it had just lost. Isla had been 6 years old. She had gone to bed that night hugging a stuffed rabbit with a torn ear that her father had won for her at a county fair, and she had woken up in a world where he no longer existed. She had not handled it gracefully, and honestly, why would anyone have expected her to? The therapists came first, 3 of them, all highly recommended, all charging rates that would have made most people's eyes water. The first one lasted 6 weeks before asking not to be rescheduled. The second tried art therapy and left after Isla threw a tray of acrylic paint at the consultation room wall with more accuracy than a major league pitcher. The third didn't even make it through 2 sessions. She sent Ariana a 2-page email full of clinical terminology that essentially said, "Your daughter needs more help than I can give." Then came the nannies. A woman named Rosalind, who had raised 3 boys in a row and prided herself on never having met a child she couldn't manage, lasted 11 days. She resigned by text message. After her came a man named Terrence, a former elementary school teacher with a calm voice and more patience than most people had in their whole lifetime. He made it to day 14 before telling Ariana, gently but clearly, that he couldn't come back. By the time spring arrived, Ariana had stopped counting. She ran her company during the day, meetings, acquisitions, legal battles, press briefings, and came home at night to a daughter who sometimes sat quietly in the corner and sometimes tried to barricade herself inside the bathroom and sometimes threw things at the walls without warning. There was no pattern to it. That was the worst part. You never knew which Isla you were going to get. The evening everything changed started out looking like every other disaster. Ariana had been stuck in a board meeting until nearly 7. By the time she got home, her head of security, a man named Walt Briggs, who had worked for her for 6 years and was not easily rattled, was waiting in the hallway outside the penthouse with a look on his face that told her everything before he said a word. "What happened?" "She found the service elevator key," Walt said. "We don't know how. She made it down to the maintenance level before anyone realized she was gone." Floor 29. Ariana's stomach dropped. "Is she hurt?" "No, she's—" He paused. He actually paused, which Walt almost never did. "She's fine. She's with someone down there." "Someone?" "A maintenance worker. Name's Mercer. Logan Mercer. He's been with the building about 2 years. Never any issues." Walt hesitated again. "She's laughing, Ms. Vaughn." Ariana looked at him for a long moment. She's what? Laughing. I pulled up the floor camera. I've been watching for the past 20 minutes and I didn't want to interrupt because he stopped like he was slightly embarrassed about what he was going to say next. I didn't want to break whatever was happening. Ariana pushed past him and walked to the security station at the end of the hall, where one of the junior monitors slid out of the chair without being asked. She leaned over the desk and looked at the screen. The footage was grainy. Maintenance floors didn't get the high-definition cameras the lobby did, but it was clear enough. Isla was sitting on an overturned plastic crate next to a workbench cluttered with tools and small mechanical parts. Across from her, crouched on a low stool and holding something small in both hands, was a man. He was big, broad-shouldered, the kind of build that suggested he'd done physical work his whole life, with close-cropped dark hair going gray at the sides, and a face that, even on a grainy camera, looked like it had some weather in it. Some history. He wasn't wearing anything special. Work pants, a maintenance department shirt with a logo on the chest, steel-toed boots. He was showing Isla something, some small metal object that he turned slowly in his fingers, explaining something Ariana couldn't hear. And Isla was leaning forward, actually leaning forward, elbows on her knees, chin in her hands, watching him the way she used to watch her father put together furniture from a flat-pack box on Saturday mornings. She was smiling. Ariana straightened up slowly. She felt something in her chest that she couldn't quite name, relief and confusion, and something that might have been embarrassment if she'd let herself sit with it. Because her daughter, who had driven away every credentialed professional Ariana had brought in, was sitting on a milk crate in the basement of the building, content. "Get me access to that floor," she said quietly. Walt put his hand out. "Ms. Vaughn, I really think—" "I'm not going to interrupt anything. I just want to see." Logan Mercer had found the girl in the corridor between the mechanical room and the storage bay, sitting with her back against the wall and her knees pulled up to her chest, arms wrapped around them like she was trying to make herself as small as possible. She was still wearing her school clothes, a pleated skirt and a blouse that had a small tear in the sleeve that someone had tried to repair badly with clear tape. Her hair was half out of a braid. She had clearly been crying, though she wasn't anymore. Now she was just staring at the floor with an expression that Logan recognized without being able to explain how. He'd seen that expression before. Not on a child, but the feeling behind it. He knew it. The look of someone who was done trying to make people understand. He didn't panic. He didn't immediately get on the radio and call it in. He crouched down to her level. Not close, not crowding her. And he looked at what she was looking at, which was nothing, and he said, "You want some water? I've got a cooler over here." The girl looked up at him. She had her mother's dark eyes, sharp and wary, but right now they were red-rimmed and exhausted. "You're supposed to call security," she said. "Probably," he said. "You want water first or no?" She stared at him for a beat. "Fine." He went to the small cooler he kept under the workbench. It was mostly for his lunch, but he had a few bottles in there, and handed her one without making a production of it. She unscrewed the cap herself and drank about half of it in one go. "What is this place?" she asked, looking around at the pipes and junction boxes and the rack of tools along the wall. "Maintenance floor. I work here." "What do you do?" "Fix things that are broken." She considered that. "Like what?" He pulled his stool over and sat down a few feet away from her. "Today I was working on a music box." That landed differently than he expected. Her eyes shifted. "A real one?" "Real enough." He nodded toward the workbench. "You can see it if you want. I'm not finished with it yet." She uncurled herself from the wall in stages, the way a kid does when they're trying not to look too interested, and followed him to the bench. The music box was sitting in pieces, the outer casing of carved wood, the internal mechanism exposed, the tiny cylinder with its raised pins, the comb of metal tines that produced the sound. "Is it broken?" she asked. The mainspring was worn out, couldn't hold tension anymore. He picked up the housing and turned it so she could see the inside. When a spring loses its tension, it can't do its job. It just sits there. Looks fine from the outside, but doesn't work. Isla was quiet for a moment, studying the exposed mechanism. "Can you fix it?" "Already did. I'm putting it back together now." He glanced at her sideways. "You want to help?" She pulled back slightly. "I'll break it." "Maybe. But I've got spare parts." He shrugged. "Only one way to find out." She thought about it for what felt like a long time for a 7-year-old. Then she climbed up onto the crate and held out her hand. They worked for 40 minutes. Logan talked her through each step without talking down to her. He told her the names of the parts like they were worth knowing: the barrel, the governor, the winding mechanism. He let her make mistakes without making a thing of it. When she accidentally dropped one of the tiny metal tines and it skittered across the floor, she went still and tense, bracing for a reaction. He just said, "Check under the radiator," and handed her the small flashlight from his breast pocket. She found it. By the time Ariana stepped quietly through the maintenance corridor door, not yet visible to either of them, Logan had set the reassembled music box on the center of the bench and was winding the key. Isla was perched on her crate, leaning forward with both hands on her knees, watching. The mechanism caught. The cylinder began to turn, and a thin, clear little melody rose up from the box, delicate and slightly imperfect, one note with just the faintest tremor, because the spring was new and still settling, and filled the quiet of the maintenance floor. Isla's face did something complicated. Her jaw went tight for a second, and her eyes went bright, and she pressed her lips together hard. Logan watched her and said nothing. "My dad used to hum," she said finally. Quietly. Not to Logan specifically, not to anyone. Just out loud, because it was there and needed somewhere to go. Logan didn't say "I'm sorry." He didn't say he understands or that it gets better or any of the things people say when they don't know what else to do. He said, "What kind of songs?" She blinked, looked at him. What kind of songs did he hum? She thought about it, really thought. Old ones. He didn't know the words to most of them, just the tune. "My daughter does that," Logan said. "Makes up words to songs when she doesn't know the real ones. Drives me a little crazy, and I love it at the same time." Isla almost smiled. Almost. "You have a daughter?" 9 years old. Her name's Nora. He nodded toward a small photo pinned to the corkboard on the wall behind the bench. A gap-toothed girl grinning in front of what appeared to be a muddy obstacle course. "She lives with me. Just the two of us." "Where's her mom?" Logan was quiet for exactly 1 beat. "She left when Nora was 2. We've been doing all right." Isla looked at the photo. Then she looked at the music box. Then she looked at her hands in her lap. "People keep trying to fix me," she said. It came out flat. Not dramatic. Just tired. Like I'm a music box. "You're not broken," Logan said simply. "You're carrying something heavy. Those are different things." She looked up at him then, really looked, like she was deciding whether to believe it. He held her gaze and didn't look away. Ariana stood in the shadow of the corridor doorway and didn't move. She had been watching for the past several minutes. She had come down ready to intervene, ready to apologize to whoever was on the other side of the door for whatever her daughter had done or said or thrown. She had come prepared for the usual, the exhausted look on a stranger's face, the careful choice of words, the barely concealed relief when Ariana showed up to take the problem off their hands. What she had not been prepared for was this. She'd watched this man, this stranger who fixed things for a living, talk to her daughter like she was a person worth talking to. No clipboard, no strategy, no controlled breathing exercises explained in that careful therapeutic voice she'd come to dread. Just a music box and a flashlight and the patient willingness to sit there. And her daughter who had not laughed out loud in 8 months, who had reduced professionals to resignation letters, who still slept with the lights on because the dark was where the thoughts got loud, was laughing now. Quietly. At something Logan had said that Ariana had missed. It was a small laugh. Nothing big. Just the sound of a child momentarily forgetting something terrible. Ariana leaned her shoulder against the door frame and let out a breath she'd been holding so long it had almost calcified. Walt's voice came from behind her, low. "You want me to—" "No." She didn't look back. Not yet. She watched Logan show Isla how the music box's governor worked, the little spinning mechanism that regulated the speed. He put it in Isla's palm, and she turned it slowly, studying it. He said something. She asked something back. He answered her like the question was worth answering. Ariana had spent 8 months building walls between her grief and the world outside, because that was what you did when you were the one everyone was looking to. You kept it contained, you made the decisions, you hired the right people, and you fixed the problems, and you did not let your 7-year-old daughter see you fall apart in the kitchen at 2 in the morning when the silence got too loud, even though you had, more than once. She had been so busy trying to fix Isla that she hadn't stopped to wonder whether Isla was the one doing the carrying. She watched the maintenance worker say something that made her daughter tip her head back and laugh again. Short, surprised, real. And she felt something shift somewhere in her chest, like a spring that had been wound too tight, finally letting go. She straightened up, turned to Walt. "Find out everything you can about Logan Mercer," she said quietly. "Not a background check. His record is probably fine. I mean, who is he? Where did he come from? What's his life?" Walt raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Ariana looked back at the screen, at her daughter sitting on a plastic crate in a maintenance room, completely at ease for the first time in 8 months. "Because whoever taught him to do that," she said. "I want to know." Walt's report came back in less than 12 hours, and it told Ariana almost nothing useful. Logan Mercer, 37 years old, born in Billings, Montana. No criminal record, no civil suits. Divorced. Or rather, abandoned, which wasn't technically the same thing legally, but amounted to the same result. One daughter, Nora, age 9, full custody. Employment history showed a gap of nearly 8 years that was listed simply as federal contractor, which could mean 100 different things, and in Walt's experience usually meant one of about 3. Before that gap, 2 years of college at Montana State, incomplete. After it, a string of skilled labor jobs, contractor, site supervisor, building maintenance, each one legitimate, each one held longer than the last. He'd been with Vaughn Tower for 2 years and 2 months. His supervisor described him as reliable, kept to himself, good with the older equipment that most of the younger guys didn't want to deal with. That was it. That was the file. "Federal contract," Ariana said, reading it again at her kitchen counter the next morning with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. "That's the whole explanation for 8 years?" "It's sealed," Walt said. "Whatever he did, whoever he did it for, it's not accessible through normal channels." "What does that mean to you?" Walt took a moment before answering. "It means he's not just a maintenance guy who was good at talking to kids." Ariana set the paper down. Through the hallway, she could hear Isla in her room, not screaming, not throwing things, just moving around. The sounds of a child getting dressed in the morning, ordinary and small, the kind of sounds that used to be invisible and now felt like something precious she was afraid to name. "Set up a meeting," she said. "Not formal. Don't make it look like an HR thing. Just, I want to talk to him." She found him in the same place she'd watched him on the security monitor, on the maintenance floor, at the long workbench, this time with his hands inside the housing panel of an HVAC control unit that had been giving the building's engineering team grief for a month. He had his sleeves rolled up and a smear of grease on his forearm, and he was squinting at something inside the panel with the focused patience of a man who had learned long ago not to rush. He heard her come in. He didn't startle. He just turned his head and looked at her the way you look at someone you were halfway expecting, and then he reached for the rag on the corner of the bench and wiped his hands. "Ms. Vaughn," he said, "you know who I am. Building directory's got photos." He set the rag down. "How's she doing?" The directness of it caught her slightly off guard. Most people who worked in the building talked around Isla's situation in that careful, slightly sideways way people had when they knew something was wrong and didn't want to seem like they were prying. Logan just asked. "She slept through the night," Ariana said. "First time in about 3 weeks." He nodded, not like it surprised him. "Good." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back without any of the particular tension that most people got when Ariana Vaughn looked at them directly. The slight straightening of posture, the unconscious shift into performance mode. He just stood there, comfortable in his own skin in a way she found oddly disorienting. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I'd like you to answer me honestly rather than carefully." "I'll try." "What did you do with her last night? What was your, I don't know what the word is, approach?" Logan thought about it for a second. "I didn't have one." "That's not an answer." "It is, actually." He leaned against the bench, arms crossed, not defensive, just settling into the conversation. "Every person she's had in her corner until now came in with a plan. You could probably feel it the second they walked through the door. Kids feel it faster. She knew before they opened their mouths that she was the problem they were there to solve." He paused. "I wasn't there to solve anything. I was just there." Ariana was quiet for a beat. She told you about her father. A little. I didn't push. Nobody gets her to talk about him. The therapist tried. She shuts down completely. She didn't talk about him because I asked, Logan said. She talked because the music box made her think of him and it came out. That's different. He looked at her steadily. She's not broken, Ms. Vaughn. She's grieving. Those two things look similar from the outside, but they're not the same problem. It was almost word for word what he'd said to Isla the night before, and hearing it again directed at her did something unexpected to Ariana's composure. She kept her face even. She was good at that. But she felt the sentence land somewhere under her sternum and stay there. I'd like to offer you something, she said. I figured. Isla needs someone consistent, someone she trusts. She kept her voice professional, the same register she used in meetings when she was making an offer. She was prepared to negotiate, but didn't want to seem too eager. I'm prepared to compensate you generously for time outside your regular work hours, weekends, occasional evenings. You'd have full discretion in terms of how you spent that time with her. I'm not looking to micromanage whatever it is you do. No, he said. She stopped. Not the money, he said, before she could respond. I'm not trying to be difficult. He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture that for the first time looked slightly uncomfortable. Money changes what something is, even when people don't mean for it to. You start paying someone to care about your kid, and somewhere along the line, even if everybody's trying their best, it stops being real. She'll feel that. Ariana looked at him. So what are you saying? You won't help. I'm saying I'll help because she needs it, not because you're paying me for it. He met her eyes. If I'm spending time with your daughter on evenings and weekends, it's because she's a kid who's carrying something heavy, and I know what that feels like from the other side. That's the only reason. He paused. Are those terms you can live with? She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, You're either the most principled person I've met in years, or you're running some kind of very long con. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. I'm a maintenance guy with a 9-year-old. I don't have the bandwidth for long cons. It started the following Saturday. Logan showed up at the building's side entrance at 8 in the morning, his daughter Nora beside him. A compact, bright-eyed girl with her father's coloring and an energy that suggested she had been awake for several hours already. She was wearing mud-stained sneakers and carrying a small backpack with a broken zipper she'd fixed with a carabiner clip. Isla met them in the lobby with the careful, sideways look she gave to all new situations, slightly behind Ariana, watching Nora from that measured distance. Nora looked at her and said without preamble, Your shoes are cool. Are they comfortable? Mine are comfortable, but they're ugly. Dad says I have to wear them until they fall apart. Isla blinked. They're okay. The left one rubs a little. Worst thing, Nora said, with the full conviction of someone for whom this was a deeply held position. Want to see something? And just like that, they were talking. Logan glanced at Ariana. She was watching the two girls move toward the elevator, already mid-conversation, and her expression was doing something he didn't look at too long because it wasn't really his business. He said, I was thinking we'd start outside. There's a park about 6 blocks east. Has a creek. A creek? Ariana repeated. Is that a problem? She looked at him. She doesn't like water, since the accident. He nodded slowly. Okay, we won't start there. He thought for a moment. Does she like to climb? I have no idea. We'll find out. What Ariana watched over the weeks that followed was not a transformation. That was too clean a word for it, too much of a before and after. What actually happened was messier and smaller and in some ways more remarkable for that. The first Saturday, Isla refused to try the rope course Logan had set up in the park. A low, simple thing, nothing more than a rope between 2 trees, maybe 4 feet off the ground, and sat on a bench with her arms crossed for 40 minutes, while Nora clambered around it with cheerful disregard for her own dignity. Logan sat on the bench too and didn't say anything useful, just ate half a sandwich and told Isla about the time he'd gotten stuck in a drainage pipe during a training exercise he couldn't describe in detail and had to be pulled out by someone he owed a significant debt to afterward. Isla said, That sounds made up? I know, he said. Wish it was. She thought about it. Then she got up and put one foot on the rope. He didn't cheer, didn't clap, just handed her the other half of his sandwich when she came back, which she ate standing up because she was too wound up to sit, and that was that. By the third week, she was running the rope course. By the fifth, she was adding her own modifications to it, routing the path differently, tying a secondary handhold onto a low branch with a knot. Logan had taught her that she couldn't remember the name of, but could replicate by feel. He taught them both how to read wind direction by watching how water moved in a shallow dish, something he presented as a game, and Ariana recognized dimly as a skill with applications well outside the park. He taught Isla a breathing pattern that he described as the way you breathe when everything's loud. 4 counts in, hold for 4, out for 6, which he'd apparently taught Nora years ago, and which he demonstrated with the matter-of-fact air of someone sharing a useful piece of household information. He made it feel like nothing special, like a normal thing a father might show his kid. He was careful about that, she noticed, about making things feel ordinary. He never built up to a lesson, never framed anything as important. The discipline came packaged inside something else, an obstacle, a problem, a game, so that Isla was already doing it before she'd had the chance to decide whether she was willing. One afternoon in the 4th week, Ariana came home early from a shareholder call that had ended better than expected, and she found them in the building's courtyard, all 3 of them, Logan and both girls, sitting on the ground in a rough circle. Nora had a notebook. Isla was talking, and Logan was listening, and from the courtyard entrance, Ariana couldn't hear the words, but she could see Isla's hands moving, describing something with the full-body involvement of a child telling a story that mattered. She had not seen Isla tell a story in 8 months. She stayed in the doorway for a moment. Then she went back inside before any of them saw her, because she didn't want to interrupt it, and also, if she was being honest with herself, because her eyes were doing something embarrassing and she needed a minute. She started finding reasons to be home earlier. It wasn't a decision she made consciously. It happened the way a lot of things were happening lately, without her planning for it, without her official approval. She'd look at her schedule at 4 in the afternoon and realize there was a thing she'd usually stay to finish that she was going to leave for tomorrow. And she didn't fully know why until she was already in the elevator going down to the parking garage. She told herself it was about Isla. Mostly, it was about Isla. She and Logan talked while the girls played. Not planned conversations, just the kind that happened when 2 people were both watching the same thing and had nowhere urgent to be. He told her about Nora in pieces, the way he seemed to tell everything. A story here, a detail there. Nothing complete, but everything real. He told her that Nora had gone through her own version of hard after her mother left, that it had looked different from Ila's grief, but had the same root, the same bewildered quality of a child trying to understand a loss that didn't follow any rules she'd been given. "How did you get through it?" Ariana asked once. They were sitting on opposite ends of a courtyard bench while Nora tried to teach Isla a card game whose rules seemed to change every 3 minutes. Logan watched the girls for a moment. "Badly, at first," he said. She waited. "I was not a patient man when she was little. I had to teach myself." He laced his hands together, looking at them. "The kind of work I used to do. Patience, there is a different thing. It's operational. You wait because you're building towards something. Waiting with a sad kid is different. There's no outcome you're aiming at. You're just there, absorbing it, letting them know that the weight of it doesn't scare you." He paused. "Took me a while to figure out I couldn't fix it. I could just hold it with her until it changed shape." Ariana was quiet for a moment. Somewhere across the courtyard, Nora accused Isla of cheating, and Isla denied it with a vehemence that suggested she absolutely had. "You were military," Ariana said. Not a question exactly. Logan looked at her. His expression didn't change, which was its own kind of answer. "Walt ran a basic employment check. 8 years of federal contractor." She kept her voice neutral. "I'm not interrogating you, I noticed." He was quiet for a beat. "It's not something I talk about." "You don't have to." He nodded. That was all. And she let it go, because she understood sealed things better than most people might have assumed, and because whatever he'd been before didn't change what she was watching him do now. The executives noticed before she did. It started with a question from Richard Calloway, Vaughn Capital's chief operating officer, a man who had the instincts of someone who was always measuring the angles during a midweek strategy meeting. He waited until most of the room had filtered out, which was his tell, and then said casually, "I heard your daughter's been spending time with someone from facilities." Ariana looked up from the papers she was gathering. She has. On a regular basis. Yes. Calloway nodded, his expression doing the careful neutral thing that people did when they'd already formed an opinion and were deciding how openly to state it. I'm just wondering whether that's, he paused, weighing words, a stable arrangement. She's doing better than she has in almost a year, Ariana said. So, yes, I'd call it stable. I only mean that from a public image standpoint. Richard, she looked at him directly. I appreciate the concern. I'll keep it in mind. He left. She stood there for a moment looking at the empty conference room. She knew what it looked like. She was not so removed from the way these things worked that she couldn't see it from the outside. The CEO of a billion-dollar company, her daughter spending weekends with a maintenance worker, the CEO herself coming home early, talking to him in the courtyard. She knew what people who looked for angles would see. The problem was that she'd stopped caring about the angle, somewhere around week 3, and she hadn't noticed until just now. She went back to her office. She had a 2 o'clock call with an acquisition team in Singapore, and a 4:30 with legal, and approximately 0 bandwidth to think about what Richard Calloway was implying. She opened her laptop and pulled up the pre-call notes, and she was very focused and very professional, and she was thinking about a man sitting on a park bench eating half a sandwich without making anything of it. Dusk, Isla started talking about her father again. Not the raw, uncontrolled way she had in those first terrible weeks after the crash, when she'd gone from screaming to total silence like someone had thrown a switch. This was different, deliberate, tentative, the way you might open a door just a crack to check the temperature. She told Logan about the flat-pack furniture, about the county fair and the stuffed rabbit with the torn ear, which was still on her bed, about a trip they'd taken to the coast when she was 4, where her father had walked into the water fully clothed because she'd been scared of the waves, and he'd wanted to show her it was okay. Logan listened to all of it the way he listened to everything, without commenting on whether the story was sad, without steering toward a lesson, without any of the subtle urgency that most adults brought to conversations with grieving children, the unconscious desire to get to the part where they feel better. He just listened. Sometimes he said, "What was he like when?" And Isla would tell him something else. Sometimes he said nothing. One evening, as Ariana was cleaning up after dinner and the girls were doing something in Isla's room involving a significant amount of tape and cardboard, Logan was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he hadn't asked for, but had taken without ceremony when she offered it. She could hear, distantly, the sound of Isla explaining something to Nora in a patient voice with only mild exasperation, the voice of a child who had an idea and was determined to execute it. She asked me today if her dad could hear her when she talked out loud, Isla said. Ariana set the dish she was drying back on the counter, slowly. What did you say? I told her I didn't know. He looked at his coffee. That's the honest answer. I don't. A pause. I told her that talking out loud doesn't hurt either way. That if it makes her feel connected to him, that's enough of a reason. Ariana was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city lights were coming on, amber and silver, the same view she'd stopped seeing sometime in the last 8 months because it had belonged to before. She talks to him, Ariana said. At night. I've heard her through the door. I know. She told me. Does that worry you? No. He said it simply, without hesitation. It means she's keeping him close. That's not something to fix. Ariana turned and looked at him. He was looking at his coffee cup, both hands around it, and he had the look of a man with more on the inside than he let out, which she had noticed early and which had not stopped being interesting to her since. Logan, she said. He looked up. Thank you. She meant it simply, which was harder than it sounded. She was not a person who said things simply. She usually put a structure around feelings, a professional frame, something that kept them from being too exposed. I don't know how else to say it. He looked at her for a moment. She's doing it herself, he said. I'm just not in the way. It was modest without being false, and that was the thing about him. He meant it. She was starting to understand that he actually meant the things he said, that he wasn't performing humility any more than he was performing patience. And that was a stranger quality to encounter in a person than she would have guessed, having spent most of her adult life in rooms full of people who were almost always performing something. From Isla's room there was a sudden crash followed by Nora's voice saying, "That was definitely not my fault," followed by Isla's laughter, bright and startled and real, and then both of them laughing together. Logan looked toward the sound. There was something in his face that Ariana recognized because she'd felt it herself in the last few weeks. The specific relief of hearing a kid laugh when you'd been waiting a long time for it. She turned back to the window so he wouldn't see her expression. Outside, the city went on being itself, lit up and indifferent, and for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, the view looked like something other than a reminder of what was gone. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Some things were better left in the air, where they could settle at their own pace without being pushed. There would be time. She thought there would be time. She didn't know yet about the people who had started asking questions. The questions started with a man named Preston Hale. Ariana didn't know that yet. She knew only that something had shifted in the building's atmosphere, in the way that things shifted in large organizations when information was moving through unofficial channels. A certain quality to the silences in meetings. The way people's eyes tracked slightly differently when she walked into a room. The conversations that stopped a beat too late to be coincidental. She'd felt it before. In the months after Daniel died, when the board was quietly testing whether the grief had softened her enough to push her aside, she recognized the texture of it. She just didn't know yet what it was about. Preston Hale was a partner at Meridian Group, a private equity firm that had been circling Vaughn Capital for 2 years, looking for a seam to get a finger into. He was the kind of man who wore his ambition the way some people wore expensive watches. Not to tell time, but to make sure you noticed. He was 44, impeccably groomed, and had built a career on finding the exact pressure point in any situation and leaning on it until something gave. He had tried 3 separate approaches to weakening Ariana's position at Vaughn Capital, and all 3 had failed, not because he wasn't good at what he did, but because she was better at defending against it than he'd anticipated. The 4th approach started with a junior analyst named Kevin Stroud, who did freelance corporate intelligence work on the side and owed Hale a favor he'd been waiting 18 months to collect. Stroud spent 6 days pulling every accessible thread on Logan Mercer's background, and at the end of those 6 days, he had enough to be interesting, though not enough to be complete. What he had was this. Logan Mercer had enlisted in the Navy at 19. His first 4 years were unremarkable, standard service record, commendations for performance, the kind of file that suggested competence without distinguishing itself. Then, at 23, the file changed character. The assignments became vague. The unit designations disappeared and were replaced by classification markers. There were deployment records with locations redacted. A medical notation that referenced injuries without specifying their nature. A commendation that had no citation attached, just a reference number that led to another sealed file. Then the 8 years of silence. Federal contractor, no details. Then a separation that wasn't a discharge, a voluntary exit, processed quietly, no fanfare. The picture wasn't complete. Stroud told Hale that directly, but the shape of it, the sealed records, the blank years, the classification markers, pointed one direction clearly enough. Logan Mercer had not been a standard serviceman. He had been something more specific, and that specificity had been deliberately buried. Hale, being Hale, understood immediately that the value wasn't in the facts themselves, but in the questions they could generate. You didn't need proof to start a fire. You needed smoke, and questions were smoke. He started with the right people. A word here, a suggestion there, placed carefully in the ears of individuals he knew would carry it forward without needing to be asked. Within 10 days, the question was circulating through the upper levels of Vaughn Capital's satellite network. Not loudly, not with any specific accusation, just a persistent wondering. Who was this man? Why was the CEO's daughter spending every weekend with a facilities employee whose military background was completely sealed? Was it possible he'd made himself useful on purpose? Was it possible Ariana Vaughn, who everyone knew was still raw from losing her husband, who was famously private and famously guarded, had simply been caught in a blind spot? Nobody said manipulation. Nobody had to. Richard Calloway brought it to Ariana on a Thursday morning in her office, with the door closed, which told her before he opened his mouth that this was going to be a conversation she didn't want to have. He sat across from her desk and put a single printed page on the surface between them. She looked at it without picking it up. It was a summary, someone's summary, not an official document, of Logan Mercer's service record, or rather, of the gaps in it. Where did this come from? She asked. That's not the important part right now. Richard. She looked at him steadily. Where did it come from? He shifted slightly. It's been circulating. Some of the board members have seen it. Shareholders in the Meridian Circle. He paused. Hale's people. Almost certainly. She picked up the page, read it once, quickly, the way she read everything. Absorbing the structure first, the details second. She set it back down. This doesn't say anything. It says his records are sealed. It says 8 years of his background are completely inaccessible through normal channels. It raises questions about why a man with that kind of history would insert himself into the life of... He didn't insert himself into anything. Her voice was even. She had a gift for evenness when she was angry. She'd learned it in boardrooms and courtrooms, and in the long months after Daniel died, when evenness was the only armor she had. My daughter wandered onto his floor. He helped her. I asked him to continue helping her. That's the complete sequence of events. I understand that, and I believe you. Calloway folded his hands on the desk. But what I believe and what's being said are two different things. And what's being said is that a man with sealed military records has been spending significant unsupervised time with the minor child of Vaughn Capital's CEO, and that the CEO in question appears to have formed a... He chose his next word with visible care. A personal attachment to this individual. The room was quiet for a moment. Are you warning me, Ariana said, or are you asking me to end it? I'm telling you what's in the air. What you do with it is your decision. He paused. It's always your decision, Ariana. You know that. After he left, she sat at her desk for a long time without doing anything. The city was visible through the window. Gray that morning, low clouds, the kind of November light that turned everything the color of old concrete. She thought about Isla laughing in the courtyard. She thought about Logan at her kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup he hadn't asked for. She thought about Nora's notebook and the rope course and the breathing pattern, 4 in, hold 4, out for 6. That Isla had been using at night when the thoughts got loud. Then she thought about Preston Hale, who she had never liked and never trusted, finding a seam. She picked up her phone and called Walt. I need to know everything about who's been asking questions about Logan Mercer, she said, and I need to know it before end of day. She didn't tell Logan right away. She told herself it was because she was still gathering information. That was partially true. But the fuller truth, the one she didn't examine too directly, was that she didn't know how to have the conversation. She had gotten used to a particular balance, a particular way things were between them, and bringing the outside world into it felt like introducing a contaminant. She saw him that Saturday as usual. The girls spent the morning at the park. Another version of the obstacle course, more complex now, with stations Ela had helped design. And the afternoon in the courtyard with the notebook, which had become a kind of shared journal between Nora and Isla, half drawings and half a story they were building together in installments. Logan noticed something was different. She could tell because he looked at her twice during a pause in conversation. Not obviously, just a quick check, the way someone does when the usual tone has shifted slightly and they're not sure whether to address it. She almost said something. Then Isla called from across the courtyard because she'd found a beetle, and the moment dissolved. That night, after both girls were fed, and Nora had fallen asleep on the couch, with her shoes still on, and Logan had carried her to the spare room without waking her, Ariana told him. She said it simply, without preamble. Laid out what Calloway had told her, what Walt had confirmed about Hale's involvement, what was currently moving through the shareholder network. She watched his face as she talked. It was hard to read. He kept things close. She'd known that from the beginning. But she could see something tighten around his eyes. Not surprise, but the specific expression of a person confronting a thing they had known was coming. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. I should tell you what the sealed records are, he said. She shook her head. You don't owe me that. No, but... He stopped. Thought. The reason they're sealed isn't because of anything bad. I want to be clear about that. Nothing criminal. Nothing that would hold up as something wrong. He looked at the table. I was part of a special operations unit for 8 years. The work was classified. Most of what we did is still classified, and I'm not going to talk about specifics because I gave my word when I left and I'm keeping it. He paused. But I'll tell you this. I left voluntarily. There was a mission in my last year that I had concerns about, serious concerns. I raised them through the right channels, and it didn't change anything. So I finished the mission because that's what you do, and then I put in my papers and I got out. He looked up at her. That's the part that isn't in any file, the why. Ariana was quiet for a moment. What kind of unit? The kind with no insignia on the shoulder. She understood what that meant. How long ago? 6 years. She looked at him. He looked back. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hum, the distant sound of the city outside, the particular stillness of late evening. This is going to get louder, she said. Hale won't stop. He'll keep pushing the angle until someone picks it up publicly, or until it creates enough noise inside the company that the board uses it as a lever. She kept her voice steady, matter of fact. I want you to know I'm not going to let that happen. I'm going to go back at him directly. And Ariana, he said her name quietly, and it was the first time he'd used it, and it landed differently than she expected. You should think about whether the fight is worth it. Of course it's worth it. For you, yes, but Nora's in that spare room. He kept his voice even, but there was something underneath it that wasn't quite calm. I've kept her out of everything her whole life, away from anything that could make her a target or a story or a detail in somebody else's problem. He looked at his hands. If this gets public, she becomes part of it. 9 years old, and she becomes part of a narrative that somebody else wrote. He paused. I can't do that to her. The room was quiet. Ariana looked at him for a long moment. She wanted to say it wouldn't come to that, but she'd been in business long enough to know that the things you promised wouldn't happen were usually the things you couldn't control. And she could see that he knew that too. Let me handle Hale, she said. And if you can't? I always handle it, she said. I've been handling it for 6 years. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not doubt exactly, but the weighing of something. Then he nodded once, slow, and reached for his coffee cup. She took that as a yes. She should have looked more carefully at what it actually was. She handled it for a while. She went directly at Meridian Group's leverage points. 2 pending regulatory reviews that required neutral third-party cooperation, which Vaughn Capital was positioned to either facilitate or complicate. She had a call with Hale's senior partner that was professionally cordial and completely clear in its subtext. Pull back, or the next 18 months get more expensive than this was worth. Hale pulled back. Temporarily. What she hadn't accounted for was the second current that had been running parallel to Hale's operation without her knowing. A financial journalist named Diana Cho, who covered corporate culture for a business publication with a circulation large enough to matter, and who had been working a broader story about executive behavior and workplace dynamics for 3 months. Cho wasn't connected to Hale. She'd stumbled onto the Mercer thread through a source inside Vaughn Capital's HR department who had mentioned, offhandedly, the unusual arrangement with a facilities employee. Cho was thorough. She was also fair, which in some ways made her more dangerous than Hale because fair reporters dug until they had enough to publish, and they published things that couldn't be dismissed as hatchet jobs. She reached out to Ariana's communications team on a Wednesday with a list of questions for comment. The questions were careful and specific. The nature of Logan Mercer's relationship with Isla Vaughn, whether background checks had been conducted, what protocols govern non-employee access to the CEO's minor child, whether the classified nature of Mr. Mercer's prior service had been disclosed to the company's board. Ariana's head of communications put the request on her desk within the hour and stood in the doorway with the look of a person who had bad news. They'd already absorbed and were waiting for her to catch up. How long does she need a response? Ariana asked. 72 hours. She's going to print regardless. Ariana read the questions again. They were fair. That was the problem. She could counter Hale's version of events because it was distorted. This was different. These were questions without malice that still had the potential to reduce Logan to a subject of scrutiny in a way that would expose everything he'd worked to keep contained. She thought about what he'd said. Nora's in that spare room. She started crafting a response with her communications team. Careful, complete, designed to contextualize without revealing anything Logan hadn't already disclosed to her. She was 3 hours into it when Walt knocked on her office door. You need to see something, he said. He handed her his phone. On the screen was a text from the building's front desk supervisor, a message that had come in 40 minutes ago from Logan's building manager contact. Logan Mercer had requested his final paycheck and turned in his building access card. Effective immediately, he had resigned. She drove to his apartment. She didn't call first because she didn't think he'd answer, and also because she was uninterested in giving him the opportunity to have a prepared response ready when she arrived. It was a 20-minute drive, and she spent most of it in the kind of focused silence she used in high-stakes negotiations. Not calming herself down, but organizing herself, putting the emotion in the right drawer so it didn't leak into the conversation before she was ready for it. His apartment was in a building 12 blocks from Vaughan Tower. A solid, older building, well-maintained, the kind of place where people stayed for years and knew their neighbors' names. She buzzed 3 times before he answered. When he opened the door, he had clearly not been expecting her, which was the first time she'd seen him actually caught off guard. He was in a plain gray t-shirt and jeans, and behind him she could see the early evidence of packing. Not boxes exactly, but the particular rearrangement of a space that happens when someone begins to mentally prepare to leave it. A stack of books on the floor beside the shelves, a duffel bag open on the chair. "You didn't say goodbye," she said. He held the door. "I was going to... To who? To Isla?" She said it flatly, not as an accusation, but as a fact being named. "You were going to disappear and send her a... What? A message through me? After everything you told her about not walking away from hard things?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped back and let her in. The apartment was spare. Not bare, but spare in the way of someone who had learned not to accumulate more than they could carry. A couch, a table, a wall of bookshelves. A corkboard in the kitchen with Nora's drawings pinned to it in a dense overlapping grid. A child's life, catalogued in crayon and marker. "Where's Nora?" Ariana asked. "Neighbor. She watches her some evenings." He moved to the window, stood with his back to her, looking out. "I wasn't going to disappear without an explanation. I was going to give you a few days to..." "A few days to what?" She kept her voice controlled. "To accept it? To explain to my daughter that the one person who managed to reach her decided the situation was too complicated?" He turned around. "That's not what this is." "Then tell me what it is." "I told you what it is." He looked at her steadily, and she could see it in his face. The thing he was doing, the familiar calculation, the one he'd probably run in far worse situations than this. The weighing of who gets protected at what cost. "Nora is 9 years old, and there is a journalist with a list of questions about my sealed military record. Once that publishes, it doesn't unpublish. She goes to school with kids who have parents who read things. She starts being the girl whose father is a story." His jaw tightened slightly. "I spent 6 years making sure she isn't anybody's story." Ariana looked at him. She understood it. She understood the instinct precisely, because she had spent 6 years of her own doing something similar, building walls high enough that the things that could hurt Isla couldn't reach her. She understood it, and she also knew, standing in this apartment looking at the duffel bag on the chair, that it was wrong. "You're doing to her what they did to you," she said quietly. He went still. Every person who walked into Isla's life saw a problem to manage and protected themselves from it when it got complicated. You showed up differently. You stayed when it was uncomfortable. You told her that carrying something heavy wasn't the same as being broken. She paused. "And now the first time it costs you something, you're leaving." The room was very quiet. Logan looked at the floor, then at the window. His hands were at his sides, and she could see the tension in them. Not anger, something more complicated than anger. The specific difficulty of someone being told something true that they don't want to be true. "She's going to stop talking again," Ariana said. "Not as a weapon, just a fact. You know that. You know her well enough to know that." "I know." His voice was low. "So don't go." He looked up at her. "Let me handle the journalist. Let me handle Hale. Let me handle the board if it comes to that. It's what I do. It's what I've been doing for 6 years, and I'm good at it." She held his gaze. "You asked me once if those were terms I could live with. I'm asking you the same thing. Can you live with letting someone else take the hit for a change?" Something moved through his expression, something complicated and private that she didn't try to name. He looked at the duffel bag on the chair, then back at her. "I'm not good at that," he said. "I know." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she started to think he was going to say no, that the wall he'd built over 6 years of singular, unshared responsibility was too solid to breach in one conversation in a spare apartment on a Thursday night. Then he said, "How's Isla?" She exhaled, small, controlled. "She doesn't know yet. I came here first. He nodded, looked at the corkboard. At Nora's drawings, horses and rockets, and one detailed rendering of a beetle that could only be the one from the courtyard last weekend. He stood there looking at it for a moment, and she could see him doing the thing she'd seen him do with Isla, the careful work of sitting inside a hard thing without flinching from it. Okay, he said finally. Okay, you'll stay? Okay, I'll stay. He paused. For now. It wasn't a full commitment, and she knew it, and she took it anyway, because partial ground was better than none, and she knew how to work with incomplete agreements. She'd built a company on them. She turned to go. She was at the door when he said her name. She looked back. The journalist's questions, he said. Some of them. The ones about the classified record. I need those to stay sealed. Not for me. There are other people in those files. People I served with. I can't have their names surfacing as collateral to someone's corporate story. She held his gaze. I understand. Do you? Yes. She meant it completely. I'll protect that. He believed her. She could see it. Not easily, not without reservation, but she could see him decide to believe her, which she understood was a more significant thing than trust that came naturally. It was trust that had been built across 8 weeks of Saturdays and courtyard conversations and evenings that had no agenda, and it was worth more to her in that moment than anything currently sitting in her portfolio. She left his apartment and stood in the corridor for a moment, letting herself breathe. She had the journalist to deal with. She had Hale still working the edges. She had a board that was watching. She had a daughter at home who didn't know any of this was happening. She had work to do. She straightened up, walked to the elevator, and started mentally drafting the call she was going to make to her communications team in the morning. She was already 3 moves ahead of where she'd been an hour ago, which was where she needed to be, and she was going to handle it. What she did not account for, what neither of them accounted for, because neither of them knew it was already in motion, was that Hale's people had not actually stopped when she'd applied pressure to Meridian Group. They had shifted approaches. Quietly, efficiently, the way people who did this for a living always did. And what they had shifted to was something more direct and considerably more difficult to manage from the outside. They had gone to Logan directly. And they had gone 3 days ago, before Ariana even knew the journalist was involved, before the access card was turned in, before the duffel bag appeared on the chair. Logan had said nothing about it. She was halfway home before that occurred to her, and when it did, she felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not quite fear, but the adjacent thing. The awareness that the situation had more dimensions than she'd been shown. She drove the rest of the way in silence, the city moving past her windows in amber and silver, and she thought about a man standing at his apartment window with his back to the room, and she wondered what they had said to him and what he had decided alone before she showed up at his door. She found out what Hale's people had said to him on a Friday morning, 10 days after she'd stood in his apartment doorway and taken his partial yes as enough. She found out because Logan told her. He called her office at 9:15, which he had never done before. Their communication had always been informal, always arranged around the girls' schedules, never initiated by him through professional channels. Her assistant put the call through with a slightly uncertain expression, like she wasn't sure what category to file it under. I need to tell you something, he said when she picked up. I should have told you the night you came to the apartment and I didn't, and I've been going back and forth about it since then, and I think not telling you is worse than telling you at this point. She leaned back in her chair. Outside her window, the city was pale and cold, the November sky the color of old pewter. All right, she said, tell me. 3 days before she'd shown up at his door, 2 men had come to his apartment. Not Hale himself. Hale was too careful for that. But 2 men who worked for a firm that Hale's company used for what they called strategic intelligence, which in practice meant the kind of thing you hired people for when you needed something done that you didn't want attached to your name. One of them had done most of the talking. The other had stood near the door and said nothing, which Logan told her was a tactic he recognized. The quiet one wasn't muscle. He was there to be noted, to make the conversation feel more significant than it would have been with just one man at a table. They told Logan that they had enough information about his service record to generate a substantial news story. Not true classified information. They were careful about that. Careful enough that they'd clearly had a lawyer advise them on the line. But enough gaps, enough redacted material, enough documented proximity to certain kinds of operations that they could frame a narrative. a former special operations soldier with a sealed record, embedded in the household of a grieving billionaire CEO, given unsupervised access to a minor child. They didn't accuse him of anything specific. They didn't have to. The frame did the work. They told him there were two ways this could go. He could leave, quietly, voluntarily, no press release, no drama, just a man who had decided to move on. And the story went nowhere. Or he could stay, and they'd hand what they had to 3 different publications simultaneously and let the coverage manage itself. Logan had listened to all of it without saying much. He'd asked one question, which was whether they were recording the conversation, and they'd said no, and he'd believed them because he knew the difference between someone who was recording and someone who wasn't. Then he told them he'd think about it, and they'd left, and he'd sat in his apartment for 3 days and thought about Nora. "And then you packed a bag," Ariana said. "And then I packed a bag." The office was quiet. From somewhere down the hall, she could hear the particular rhythm of a conference call, the slight delay, the 2 loud voices, and beneath it the hum of a building conducting its business. "Why didn't you tell me that night?" she asked. Not accusatory. She genuinely wanted to understand the sequence. "Because you came in ready to fight," he said, "and I didn't want to hand you a fight that was going to cost you more than I was worth." She let that sentence sit for a moment. Then she said, "That's not your calculation to make." "I know. That's why I'm telling you now." She was quiet for a moment. She was running the information through the part of her mind that handled threats, mapping it, measuring it, looking for the edges. What Hale's people had done was not technically illegal, but it was close enough that it was useful to her. Coercion, even when dressed in plausible deniability, left traces. People who conducted that kind of conversation got confident over time and sloppy. They used the same methods, the same people, the same language. "Do you remember their names?" she asked. "No, but I'd recognize their faces." "The firm they work for, did they give you any identifying information?" "No, but they drove a rental and I got a partial plate." She almost smiled, which surprised her. "Of course you did." "Old habit." She reached for a notepad. "Give it to me." He read off 6 digits from memory without hesitation. She wrote them down and underlined them twice. "Logan," she said. "Yeah." "Thank you for telling me." She paused. "I know that wasn't easy." "Easier than letting you walk in blind," he said, "which is what I was doing." After she hung up, she sat for a moment with her hand still on the phone, thinking about a man who had spent 8 years in situations where the wrong decision got people killed, learning to carry everything himself, learning that asking for backup was a calculation you made about operational efficiency and not about whether you were allowed to need it, and then spending 6 years afterward applying that same principle to fatherhood. She thought about the fact that he had called her, that he'd sat with it for 10 days and then picked up the phone, which for someone wired the way he was wired was not a small thing. It was the equivalent, she thought, of someone else showing up at a door. She picked up the notepad and called Walt. By the following Wednesday, she had enough. The partial plate, combined with the rental company's regional affiliates and a contact Walt had at a private investigations licensing board, led them to the firm within 48 hours. It was a small operation, 4 people, incorporated in Delaware, the kind of setup that existed specifically to be difficult to trace. But difficult wasn't impossible, and Walt was thorough. He found 2 prior engagements where the firm had conducted similar approaches for Meridian Group adjacent clients. One of those had resulted in a civil settlement, sealed, but its existence was documented in court records. She had her corporate attorneys draft a formal letter to Meridian Group's legal team. It was measured and specific, and it detailed, without dramatic language, exactly what had occurred and exactly what Vaughn Capital's response would be if it continued. She also sent a separate personal note to Hale's senior partner, the one she'd spoken to previously, making clear that the sealed settlement from the prior engagement was now in her possession and that she had no particular interest in making it public as long as the situation was resolved cleanly. Hale went quiet within 24 hours. Diana Cho's story was trickier because Cho wasn't operating from malice and couldn't be pressured the way Hale could. Ariana spent 3 hours with her communications team and then 2 hours with her personal attorney before deciding that the right approach was not to try to kill the story, but to shape what it said. She asked for a sit-down with Cho. Off the record, no cameras, no recorder. And Cho, to her credit, agreed. They met at a restaurant near Cho's office on a Thursday afternoon, just the two of them. Cho was younger than Ariana had expected, early 30s, composed, with the particular quality of someone who had trained themselves not to be rushed. She had a notepad, but she kept it closed on the table between them, which Ariana read as a gesture of good faith. Ariana told her the truth. She told it simply and in the right order. Isla, on the maintenance floor, the music box, the weeks of Saturdays, what had changed in her daughter. She told her what Logan had done, and what he hadn't done, and what he had refused to take. She told her about Hale's operation, including the two men who had gone to Logan's apartment, because that was a story in itself, and Cho was going to want it. She did not tell her what was in the sealed record. She was clear about that up front, and she stayed clear about it throughout. There are other people in those files, she said, people who have nothing to do with any of this. I won't put them at risk for a story. Cho looked at her across the table for a long moment. That's the part everyone wants, she said. The military background, the classified history. I know. Without it, I've got a corporate influence story and a CEO who made an unusual personnel decision. You've also got a private equity firm running covert pressure operations against a public company's executive, Ariana said, which is considerably more interesting than my personnel decisions and considerably more verifiable. Cho was quiet for a moment, tapping one finger against the edge of her notepad. I'd want Logan Mercer on the record, she said finally. Not about the classified material, just about who he is. That's his decision, Ariana said. Not mine. Would he? I don't know, I'll ask. She asked him that evening, sitting at her kitchen table with the same cup of coffee she'd always offered and he'd always taken, while the girls were in Isla's room doing something that involved a great deal of strategic discussion about a card game whose rules Nora had apparently revised again. She laid it out for him. What Cho wanted. What it would mean. His name, his face. A version of his story that he controlled rather than one that someone else assembled from fragments and gaps. Logan was quiet for a while after she finished. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. She'd noticed he did that when he was thinking, a small, unconscious rotation. On the record about what exactly? He asked. Who you are, why you left the service, what you've been doing since. She paused. Nothing classified. Everything that matters is classified. Not everything. She held his gaze. The reason you got out isn't in any file. You told me that yourself. He was quiet again, longer this time. Nora would see it, he said. She would. She doesn't know most of it. What does she know? He thought about it. She knows I used to do dangerous work and I stopped because I wanted to be home with her. He paused. She knows something happened that made me decide to leave. She's never asked the details and I've never offered them. How old is she now? 9. She's going to ask eventually. He looked at his hands. I know. The apartment was quiet around them in the particular way of evening, the city beyond the windows settling into its nighttime register, lower and more diffuse than the daytime noise. I'm not telling you to do it, Ariana said. It has to be your call. Cho will write something either way. With Hale's story at the center, we have more control over what that looks like, but you don't owe anyone your story. Logan looked up at her. What do you want me to do? She was slightly caught off guard by the directness of it, the way he asked her, specifically her, rather than framing it as a general question. It was the kind of thing that happened between people who had stopped pretending they were having professional discussions. I want you to do whatever lets you sleep, she said. He almost smiled. That's not an answer. I know. He looked at his coffee, then at the hallway, in the direction of Isla's room, from which Nora's voice was audible, explaining something with great conviction. Let me think about it overnight, he said. She nodded. She would give him that. She was getting better at giving him time, which was something she hadn't been particularly good at for most of her adult life. He agreed to it the next morning. A single phone call, brief, no preamble. He'd talk to Cho. His terms were straightforward. No classified material, no operational details. Nothing that named any other person he had served with. His reasons for leaving, yes. His life since, yes. What he'd found on the maintenance floor of a building on a Tuesday evening with a 7-year-old who was done letting adults try to fix her, yes, that too. Cho published 8 days later. The story was not what Ariana had expected, which was itself something she noted. She had expected Cho to prioritize the Hale angle, the corporate warfare, the coercion, the private equity pressure campaign, which was genuinely newsworthy. Cho used it, but it wasn't the spine. The spine was Logan. Not Logan, the former special operations soldier. Not Logan, the mystery with the sealed file. Logan, the single father who had learned patience by necessity and compassion by choice, who had left a career that defined him because he'd looked at what it was costing and decided his daughter was worth more than the identity, who had sat on a plastic crate in a maintenance room with a music box and a frightened child and not tried to fix anything, who had, when asked, helped because a kid needed it and not for any other reason. Cho had quoted him directly, at length, and reading it, Ariana heard his voice in the words, spare, exact, without decoration. At one point, Cho asked him what he would say to the people who had suggested he'd inserted himself into the CEO's life for personal gain. Logan had apparently been quiet for a moment and then said, I turned down money. I turned down a formal arrangement. I showed up because a little girl was hurting, and I knew what that looked like from the inside. If someone wants to build a story out of that, they're working harder than the facts deserve. The piece ran on a Thursday. By Friday, it had been shared considerably, which Ariana tracked with the measured attention she gave to anything that could affect the company and then set aside because she didn't actually care about the numbers. What she cared about was what happened in Vaughn Capital's 38th floor conference room on Friday afternoon when she walked into a board meeting for the first time since Cho's story published. Calloway was there. 3 other board members, 2 independent directors she trusted, and 1 she didn't particularly. She sat at the head of the table and looked at each of them in turn the way she always did at the start of a meeting. The brief, even look that said she knew the room and had already measured it. Nobody said anything about Logan Mercer. They talked about Q4 projections. They talked about the Singapore acquisition, which was progressing. They talked about regulatory filings. The meeting ran 40 minutes and adjourned without drama. Calloway passed her in the doorway afterward and said quietly, the Cho piece was well handled. And she nodded once and kept walking because she didn't need his evaluation. But she noted its absence. Whatever leverage Hale had hoped to create with the board had evaporated. The story that was supposed to raise questions had instead answered them, and answered them in Logan's favor in a way that no managed press release from her communications team could have manufactured. He had done it himself, in Cho's story, by saying nothing more than what was true. The gala had been on the calendar for months. Vaughn Capital's annual children's charity event, a fundraiser for pediatric programs at 3 local hospitals, held every November in the building's grand ballroom, which got dressed up once a year for the occasion, and spent the other 11 months as an event space that hosted less interesting things. It was the kind of event that Ariana usually managed from a professional distance. She chaired it, she gave the opening remarks, she worked the room with the particular efficiency of someone who had attended enough of these to know exactly how to be present without being absorbed. This year was different before it started. 3 weeks before the gala, Isla had appeared in the kitchen doorway while Ariana was reviewing the event program and said, without leading up to it, I want to play something. Ariana looked up. At the gala? I've been practicing. She said it the way she said most things lately. Direct, slightly defensive, ready for a no. Logan taught me a piece before. She stopped. Before. She didn't explain which before. She didn't have to. I want to finish learning it and play it there. Ariana set down the program. Show me, she said. Isla went to the piano in the living room, a Yamaha upright that had been in the apartment since before Daniel died and had been silent for most of the past year, and sat down and played. It was not perfect. She stumbled twice in the middle section and the tempo was uneven in places. But the piece itself was something, a melody that was simple on the surface and had something underneath it that Ariana couldn't name, the kind of song that sounded like it had been written by someone who understood that beautiful things and sad things were often the same thing viewed from different angles. Where did Logan find that? Ariana asked when Isla finished. He wrote it, Isla said, for Nora. When she was little and she was sad. She looked at the keys. He said I could play it. Ariana was quiet for a moment. I want to play it at the gala, Isla said again. Will you let me? Yes, Ariana said. No hesitation. She told Logan about it the next time she saw him. He had come back to the building, not to his maintenance position, which had been filled, but as a kind of informal presence that had solidified over the weeks since the Cho story, spending time with the girls on weekends and occasional evenings the way he had before, with no formal arrangement and no money changing hands. He was quiet when she told him. He was in the courtyard watching Nora and Isla run some elaborate new version of the obstacle course that now involved timing each other with Nora's watch. "She told you I wrote it?" he said. "She did." He looked at the girls. "It's not very good." "It's very good," Ariana said. "I wrote it in 20 minutes on a bad night when Nora was 4 and wouldn't stop crying and I didn't know what else to do." He paused. "I'm not a musician." "You play guitar." "Barely." "Isla thinks you play well." He was quiet for a moment. "It was just something to do with my hands when things were hard," he said. "You have to do something with your hands." She looked at him sideways. "I was watching the girls with that particular quality he had when he was watching them. Attentive without being intrusive, present without pressing." "Will you come?" she asked. He looked at her. "To the gala." "Isla's going to be nervous. She'd do better knowing you're there." He looked back at the courtyard. Nora had apparently cheated at the timing, and Isla was making her case against it with considerable legal precision. "Yeah," he said. "I'll come." The gala was on a Saturday. The ballroom was full by 7, 300 people, the usual mixture of corporate donors, board members, hospital administrators, and the particular species of wealthy philanthropist that appeared at these events every year wearing slightly different clothes. The room was warm and loud in the way ballrooms got when they were working correctly, the noise of many conversations running together into a kind of ambient energy. Ariana worked the room. She was good at it, present, attentive, moving with the practiced ease of someone who had learned that working a crowd was a skill with techniques, not a talent you either had or didn't. She noticed Logan standing near the back with Nora, both of them in clothes that were clearly not their usual register. Nora in a dark blue dress that she kept looking down at with the expression of someone monitoring a situation. Logan in a jacket and collared shirt that suited him better than she'd have expected. He caught her eye across the room and gave a small nod, which was his version of a wave. She looked back at him for a moment and then continued toward the next conversation she needed to have. Isla's performance was scheduled for 8:15, between the opening remarks and the first dinner course, a deliberate placement, when the room was full and settled but before people's attention began migrating toward their food and their phones. At 8:10, Ariana found Isla backstage, in the narrow corridor between the service entrance and the stage wing, standing very still in a dark green dress, with her hands clasped in front of her, and her jaw set in the expression that meant she was frightened and refusing to show it. "You don't have to," Ariana said. "I know." Isla looked straight ahead. "I want to." "If you get up there and you freeze, it doesn't matter. Nobody will." "I won't freeze," Isla said. She said it with a certainty that Ariana recognized. It was the same certainty with which she'd gotten up from the bench on the first Saturday and put her foot on the rope. Not the certainty of someone who wasn't scared. The certainty of someone who had decided fear wasn't going to run the decision. Ariana put a hand on her daughter's shoulder, briefly, and then stepped back because Isla didn't like being hovered over. "I'll be in the front row," she said. She was in the front row when Isla walked out. The room noticed her. 300 people, the natural murmur settling as a child walked alone across a large stage to a piano bench, sat down, adjusted herself once, and looked at the keys. Someone near the back coughed. A waiter froze with a tray. Isla put her hands on the keys. And she played. She was not perfect. The stumble from the practice sessions appeared in the same place, the tempo still uneven in the middle section. But the piece itself, Logan's piece, the thing he'd written in 20 minutes on a bad night when Nora was 4, came through in all its particular quality, the simplicity that had something underneath it. The room was very quiet. And then, from the wing stage left, came another sound. A guitar, not amplified, picked up quietly and naturally, finding the melody by ear and holding it steady beneath the piano the way a hand might hold something fragile, not overtaking it, just present, just supporting. Ariana turned her head. Logan stepped out from the wing. He was looking at Isla, not the audience. He positioned himself off to the side, slightly back, not center stage, not presenting himself, just close enough that the music connected and Isla could hear him. He had a battered acoustic guitar that she had not known he'd brought, and he played it the way he did everything, without performing it, without calling attention to the doing. But the room had already reacted. 300 people had gone from polite attention to something different. The sound of the guitar joining the piano was unexpected enough that it broke through the social film that settled over charity events, the automatic register of obligation that kept everyone pleasant and slightly distant. People leaned forward, people stopped checking their phones, and Isla heard him come in. Ariana saw the moment it happened. Her daughter's shoulders dropped slightly, released from something. The tempo steadied. Her hands moved with more confidence, like she'd been holding her breath and was now allowed to exhale. They played the full piece together. It ran maybe 4 minutes. When the last note faded, the room held the silence for a beat. The specific beat of an audience that has been unexpectedly caught. And then the applause started. Genuine applause, the kind that comes from a different place than polite appreciation. Isla stood up from the bench and turned to face the room, and in that moment she looked more like herself than she had in over a year. Not performed composure, just her. 7 years old, slightly flushed, slightly defiant, present in her own skin. Then she looked across the stage at Logan, and she walked across it, and she threw herself at him the way kids do when they've stopped calculating. Full speed, complete, trusting that he'd catch her. He did, one arm around her while the guitar hung from his other hand, and she pressed her face into his shoulder. The microphone at the front of the stage was picking up some of it. Not all. But enough that the room heard her voice, muffled and clear at once. "You came." "I said I would," he said. "I know." A pause. "He's the only one," she said, louder now, turning her head so that her voice carried. Ariana didn't know if she did it on purpose or not, and it didn't matter. "Who was never afraid of me." The ballroom was very quiet. Ariana was on her feet before she'd made the conscious decision to stand. She walked across the front of the room, up the stage steps, and across the stage, and she felt 300 pairs of eyes, and didn't care about any of them. She stopped at the center of the stage. She looked at the room, at the board members, at the donors, at the shareholders she recognized, and the executives she'd been managing for years, and the table in the corner where Richard Calloway sat very still with an unreadable expression. She did not plan what she said. She had not prepared remarks for this moment because this moment had not existed until 30 seconds ago. What she said came from the same place her best decisions always came from. Not strategy, not management, but clarity. "I want to tell you about this man," she said. Her voice carried in the quiet room without effort. Not because it helps anyone's quarterly expectations. Not because it makes the company look good, though it should. She paused. "Logan Mercer spent 12 weeks with my daughter. He never signed a contract. He never accepted payment. He never asked for anything from me or from this company." She looked at the room steadily. "He showed up on his own time, at no benefit to himself, and he sat with a little girl who was in pain until she remembered she knew how to laugh. He did it because that's who he is, and he kept doing it when people in this room started asking uncomfortable questions about his past. And he continued doing it after anonymous pressure was applied to try to make him stop." The room was very still. "Every question that was asked about his intentions was answered by his actions," she said. "He never sold his access to me. He never leveraged my daughter's attachment to him. When it got complicated, his first instinct was to walk away to protect us, not to use the situation, but to remove himself from it." She paused. "I have been in business for 12 years. I have sat across from some of the most accomplished people in this industry. The most integrity I have seen in one person in that time has been in a man who fixed the HVAC system in this building." She stopped. "I wanted the people in this room who raised doubts about him to hear me say that directly. So there's no ambiguity, so it's on record." She didn't look at Calloway. She didn't need to. She looked at Logan. I was looking back at her with Isla still in his arm, and an expression that was hard to read, which for him was not unusual, but underneath it was something she recognized because she'd seen it once before. The specific look of someone deciding whether to believe that they're allowed to have something they've spent a long time not having. The applause started somewhere in the middle of the room and moved outward. Not polite applause, the real kind. And then from beside Logan came a small, serious voice. "Dad?" Nora said, appearing from the wing where she'd apparently been watching the entire time. "You have to say something." Logan looked down at his daughter. "Do I?" Yes. She was firm about it, the way she was firm about most things. Because it's your turn. He looked at Nora, then at Isla, who had pulled back from his shoulder and was watching him with an expression that was an exact duplicate of her mother's when she was waiting for something important. Then at the room, 300 people waiting. He shifted the guitar. He was not comfortable on a stage. Ariana could see that, the slight adjustment in how he was standing, the minimal version of a person recalibrating. He looked at the microphone at the front of the stage and moved toward it slowly. I'm not good at this, he said into the microphone. A beat. Anyone who knows me will tell you I'm not good at this. A small ripple of sound moved through the room. Not quite laughter, but something warmer. I spent 8 years doing work that I can't talk about in detail, he said. Some of it I'm proud of, some of it I'm not. The part I'm not proud of is what eventually made me stop. He paused, looking at the guitar rather than the audience. I left because I reached a point where I didn't recognize what I was becoming. And when you reach that point in that kind of work, you have two choices. You can tell yourself it's the job and keep going, or you can accept that the job is changing you in a direction you don't want to go, and you leave. He looked up. I left. The room was quiet. Everything after that has been about figuring out how to be a father, which is harder than anything I did before it, and I did some genuinely hard things. He paused. I'm not good at asking for help. I'm not good at letting people carry part of it. That's something I'm still working on. He looked at Ariana. I'm working on it. He stopped. He looked down at the guitar again like he was deciding whether there was anything else worth saying, and apparently decided there wasn't, because he stepped back from the microphone. Nora immediately reappeared from the wing and tugged his sleeve. That was good, she said, with the authority of someone delivering a verdict. Thanks, he said. You're welcome. She looked at Isla. Do you want to do this card game now or after dessert? Isla considered it with full seriousness. After dessert, she said. So we have time to set it up right. Good call, Nora said. And the two of them walked off the stage together, already talking about logistics, while 300 people in formal wear watched them go, and the applause came back, softer this time and more sustained. Ariana stood at the center of the stage in the open quiet and looked at Logan. He looked back at her. You wrote that piece, she said. Not loud, just between them. In 20 minutes, he said, on a bad night. It's very good, she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, thank you for what you said. I meant every word. I know you did. He shifted the guitar again. That's why it mattered. The room was coming back to life around them. The hum of conversation returning, the waitstaff moving again, the particular social mechanism of a large event resuming after an interruption. But where they were standing felt separate from all of it, the way certain moments are separate, the way things that have shifted don't immediately rejoin the ordinary noise of everything else. Come to dinner, she said. After this, just us. The girls. He looked at her for a moment. Yeah, he said. Okay. That was all. It was enough. Dinner that night was not elegant. Ariana had made a reservation at a restaurant near the building. Somewhere quiet, somewhere that wasn't the penthouse, because the penthouse had started to feel like a place that needed to be left occasionally, aired out, reminded that the world existed outside its 42 floors. But by the time they got downstairs, Nora had announced that she wanted noodles specifically, the kind from the Thai place 4 blocks east that she and Logan went to sometimes on Fridays. And Isla had immediately sided with her in the unconditional way she sided with Nora on most things now. And Logan had looked at Ariana with an expression that said he was entirely prepared to be outvoted. So they went to the Thai place. It was narrow and slightly too loud, and the menus were laminated, and one of the overhead lights had a flicker that nobody had fixed. Nora and Isla sat on the same side of the booth and immediately began a whispered negotiation about something that they stopped having when an adult looked directly at them. Logan ordered without looking at the menu, which meant he'd been here enough times to have a usual. Ariana ordered something at random because she was still inside the evening, still processing the ballroom and the stage, and 300 people, and what she'd said into the open air of a room that had been listening. The food came fast. Nora ate with the focused efficiency of a child who took meals seriously. Isla stole a piece of Nora's pork without asking, and Nora took 2 of Isla's dumplings in immediate retaliation, and neither of them commented on it because they had apparently established a barter economy that didn't require verbal acknowledgement. Logan watched them with the look he got sometimes. Not sentimental, not soft, just present. Like watching them was something he did on purpose rather than something that happened to him. "You okay?" he asked. He was looking at Ariana. "I'm fine," she said, which was mostly true. She was tired in the particular way of someone who had spent emotional currency they hadn't fully known they were carrying. "I keep going over what I said on the stage." "Which part?" "All of it, any of it." She turned her water glass. "I don't usually do things without a plan." How did it feel? She thought about it honestly. Terrifying, and then immediately correct, which is an unusual combination. He nodded. "Yeah," he said, "I know that combination." They ate. The girls finished before the adults and moved immediately into the card game they'd been postponing since the ballroom, using the laminated menus as makeshift card holders and arguing cheerfully about rules. The flicker in the overhead light kept its irregular rhythm. Somewhere near the kitchen, someone dropped something metal, and it rang out sharp and brief, and Nora didn't even look up. Ariana watched her daughter. Isla was concentrated on her cards, tongue slightly between her teeth. Her green dress now slightly wrinkled from the evening's events, her braid half undone in the back. She looked like a child who was exactly where she was supposed to be. 8 months ago, she had not been able to sleep through the night. 8 months ago, 3 trained professionals had looked at her and written resignation letters. There was no clean explanation for what had changed. That was the thing about it. There was no single technique, no breakthrough session, no moment that could be clinically documented and replicated. A man had sat on a plastic crate and offered half a sandwich and not tried to fix anything, and something had shifted. It was that simple and that unreproducible, and Ariana had made peace with the fact that she would probably never fully understand it, which was its own kind of discipline for a woman who had built her entire professional life on being able to understand things and then manage them. "Logan," she said, quietly enough that the girls didn't look up. He looked at her. "What did it actually cost you?" she asked. "Not the job. Not the situation with Hale. I mean," she paused, trying to find the right edge of the question. "You walked into something you didn't have to walk into, and then you stayed when staying was difficult. What did that cost you personally?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his bowl, turning his chopsticks in one hand. "Sleep," he said finally. "Some sleep." He paused. "I spent a lot of the early weeks going back and forth about whether I was doing the right thing, whether being around Isla was helping or whether I was just inserting myself into a situation I had no business being in because it felt familiar." He set the chopsticks down. "I'd been in her position, not as a kid, but that feeling of carrying something that nobody around you knows how to hold. I recognized it, and I didn't know for a while whether I was responding to her or to something in myself." Ariana looked at him. "Which was it?" "Both," he said, "which is usually how it works." He looked at the girls. "You can't fully separate the two. You help someone because you recognize something in them and because you genuinely want them to be okay, and both those things are true at the same time. Pretending it's purely selfless is its own kind of lie." She thought about that for a moment. "When did you stop going back and forth about it?" "About week 4. When she fixed the secondary handhold on the rope course." He almost smiled. "She didn't need me to show her that. She figured it out herself and tied it correctly on the first try. I didn't teach her that specific knot. She just absorbed enough to extrapolate." He paused. "That's when I knew she was going to be okay regardless. She had it in her. She just needed someone to be in the way less." Ariana looked at him for a long moment. He looked back without any of the performance of looking back, and she thought, not for the first time but with more clarity than before, that this was the most unusual person she had met in a very long time. Not unusual in the way that people were unusual when they were eccentric or difficult or deliberately singular. Unusual in the simpler, rarer way of being almost entirely what they appeared to be. "I'm going to do something," she said. "I've been thinking about it for a few weeks, and I'd like to tell you because it involves you if you're willing." He waited. "I'm stepping back from Vaughn Capital." She said it plainly, the way she'd made all the significant decisions in her life, without softening the edges. Not selling, not disappearing. But the day-to-day operational role, The board can manage it with a CEO in place. I'll stay on as a strategic advisor, which means I keep influence without being the one who has to be in every room for every decision. She paused. I've been doing it for 6 years because Daniel's death made me feel like I had to prove I could carry everything that had been ours, that the company wouldn't fall without him, that I wouldn't fall without him. She looked at the table. I proved it. I know I proved it, but I've been proving it past the point where it was necessary and into the point where it's just... She stopped. Where it's just habit dressed up as purpose. Logan was quiet. I want to start a foundation, she said. There are kids like Isla everywhere, not just wealthy kids, kids in under-resourced communities, kids in foster care, kids who've lost parents or had parents who were never really there, kids who are carrying things that the adults around them don't know how to hold. She paused. I want to build something that uses what worked. Outdoor challenges, music, mentorship from people who've actually been through hard things, not polished programs with branded materials, real things. She looked at him. I'd like you to run it. He looked at her. Not as a favor, she said quickly. Not as whatever this has been, which I understand you don't want converted into a professional arrangement. I mean as something real. A real role, a real salary. Something where what you actually know and what you've actually done gets used at scale rather than for one kid at a time. He was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that Nora looked up from the card game, seemed to take a reading of the atmosphere, and went back to her cards without saying anything. That's not a small thing, he said finally. No. I'd need to think about it. I know. She kept her voice steady. Take the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. He looked at her, and what moved across his face was complicated enough that she didn't try to read it fully. She'd gotten better at leaving room for things to be complicated rather than immediately trying to resolve them into something manageable. That was another thing this year had taught her. Okay, he said. Not yes. Not no. Okay. She'd learned to work with that. He gave her his answer 3 weeks later. Not in the kitchen, not in a courtyard conversation, not in any of the places where their most important exchanges had happened. He gave it to her on a Tuesday morning by showing up at the office address she'd given him for the foundation, a space she'd leased in a building 12 blocks from the tower, 3 rooms that were still largely empty, the kind of beginning that looked more like a question than an answer, and walking in with a notepad under his arm and sitting down at the table in the center room and saying, I've been thinking about the structure. Ariana looked up from the box she'd been unpacking. Good morning, she said. The mentorship component needs to be the spine, he said, ignoring her tone in the good-natured way he ignored most things that were beside the point. The outdoor programs are important, but they're methods. Mentorship is the relationship. The relationship is what actually changes something. He set the notepad on the table. He'd filled 6 pages with notes, which was more text than she had ever seen him produce voluntarily, and his handwriting was small and precise. And the mentors need to be trained, not in a lecture series with a certificate at the end. In something real, something that takes time. She set down what she was holding and looked at him across the table. You've been planning this for 3 weeks. 2.5. The first few days I was still deciding. What decided you? He thought about it. Nora asked me what I was going to do next, he said. She asks me that sometimes. She's been asking since I left the service. What's next? Like she's checking in. He paused. I told her about the foundation, the rough version. She said, that sounds like what you already do, but for more people. He looked at his notepad. She's 9 and she was right. Ariana looked at him for a moment. She could feel herself wanting to say something larger than the situation called for, something that matched the weight of what she felt. And she had the discipline now to not do that, to let the moment be what it was without adding to it. We'll need a program director, she said. Someone who understands child development and can work alongside the mentors. I know someone, he said. She ran youth programs for a veterans organization for 7 years. She left last year because the funding dried up. She's good. Get me a name. He slid a page from the notepad across the table. He'd written it already. She picked it up and felt something she recognized as happiness, which was different from relief and different from satisfaction and different from the particular cold clarity of a successful negotiation. She hadn't felt it with any regularity in a long time, and its texture was surprising, quieter than she remembered it being. less like an event and more like a quality of light. The Foundation's first 6 months were difficult in the ways that first 6 months of anything real are difficult. They found their first cohort of 12 kids through 3 community organizations, a foster care network, a grief counseling nonprofit, and a school district program for children with documented trauma histories. The kids ranged in age from 6 to 13, and they were not, collectively, easy. They had been failed by enough adults that their default mode with new adults was a calibrated suspicion that had to be respected before it could be worked with. 2 of them quit the program in the first month. 1 came back. The other didn't, and that was a fact Logan logged and kept and used to revise the intake process. He did not expect things to work the first time. He expected things to need adjusting, which they always did, and he approached each adjustment with the patience of someone who had spent years understanding that the first plan was always just the map, and the territory was always different. Ariana watched him work with the kind of careful attention she usually reserved for high-stakes deals. He was not a natural administrator. The paperwork was a genuine struggle, and he was the first to acknowledge it. But as a program architect, he was precise and thoughtful and fiercely unwilling to cut corners on the human parts. When a 9-year-old boy named Marcus refused to speak during group sessions, and one of the staff suggested separating him from the group, Logan said quietly that Marcus wasn't disrupting anything by being quiet, and that presence without participation was still presence and was worth protecting. Marcus started talking in the 3rd month, not to a staff member first, to another kid in the program, a 12-year-old girl named Talia, who had her own version of silence and had apparently recognized his. They were both in the outdoor section, sitting on opposite ends of a log, while the rest of the group worked on a fire-starting exercise, an activity Logan had borrowed, barely modified, from something he'd learned in a context he still didn't talk about in detail. When Talia said something to Marcus that nobody else heard, he said something back. By the end of the session, they were working together. Logan told Ariana about it that evening. They were at the Foundation office, the one that didn't look quite as much like a question anymore. There were things on the walls now, a whiteboard with the program structure, photos from the first outdoor sessions, Nora's drawing of the courtyard beetle that had migrated from Logan's apartment corkboard to here, where it held a position of honor near the window. "That's the thing," he said. "You can structure for it all you want. You can design the right environment and put the right people in it and create the right conditions. But the actual thing, the moment it works, that happens between kids, between people. You can't manufacture it." He paused. "The best you can do is not get in the way." Ariana leaned against the window. Outside, the city was doing what the city did in late winter. Pale, cold, the trees in the park across the street beginning to show the first hesitant suggestions of buds that weren't open yet, just the promise of them. "Is that hard for you?" she asked. "Not getting in the way?" He looked at her. "Still working on it," he said. "Every day." She smiled. He saw it, and something shifted in his expression. Not his usual controlled quiet, but something warmer, something that had been building slowly through months of kitchens and courtyards and Thai restaurants with flickering lights. Something that neither of them had named directly, because neither of them was particularly good at naming things before they were ready. "Logan," she said. "Yeah." She held his gaze. "I'm glad you were on the wrong floor." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Me too." It wasn't more than that. It didn't need to be. Some things accumulated through the small, repeated gestures of showing up, through the decisions to stay when leaving was easier, through the choosing, again and again, to be present rather than protected. You didn't need a grand declaration for something that had been built that carefully. You just needed to say it out loud once, so it was real in the air between you and not just real in the chest where you'd been carrying it. Isla turned 8 in March. She wanted her birthday at the park, the one 6 blocks east, with the creek she had initially refused to go near and had been wading in with her shoes off since October. She wanted the obstacle course, which had been rebuilt twice since its original version and now incorporated elements that would have been unrecognizable from the first rope between 2 trees. She wanted cake from the bakery on the corner, the one with the too sweet frosting that Ariana didn't particularly like, and that Isla had been devoted to for 3 years. She wanted Nora there, obviously, and Logan and Walt, who had been coming to things quietly for months, and who Isla had decided she liked, in part because he was serious about things, and she appreciated seriousness in adults. She said, no therapists. Ariana said that wasn't a birthday wish she needed to make because it wasn't something she had to fight for anymore. Isla looked at her for a moment. Then she said, can I bring my rabbit? She meant the stuffed rabbit with the torn ear. The one from the county fair, the one that had been through everything. Of course, Ariana said. I want to put it in the creek. I don't mean lose it. I just want to see if it floats. Ariana looked at her daughter. Isla looked back with the matter-of-fact expression of someone who had thought about something and arrived at a conclusion that made sense to them. Okay, Ariana said. The rabbit floated. It was waterlogged and listing slightly to the left, and its fur was going to be terrible afterward, but it stayed on the surface of the creek while Isla stood in the water in her shoes. She'd forgotten to take them off this time, or decided not to, and watched it move slowly downstream until Logan reached in from the bank and picked it up before it got too far. He held it out to her. She took it. She stood in the creek for a moment, holding the wet rabbit, looking at nothing in particular. He would have liked this, she said. She didn't look at anyone when she said it. She said it the way she'd been saying it for a few months now. Quietly, factually, without the raw edge that had been there before. The edge that meant the saying of it cost something. It still cost something. That never went away entirely. But the shape of it had changed. Yeah, Logan said from the bank. What was he like at parties? Isla looked up. He sang. Like not good singing. He didn't care. She waded back toward the bank. He would do a voice for everything, like the cake had a voice. The balloons. What kind of voice did the balloons have? She thought about it seriously. High, but also kind of nervous. She climbed out of the creek, shoes squelching, and held the rabbit by one ear so it dripped away from her dress. Like they knew they were going to pop eventually. Logan made a sound that was almost a laugh, a real one. That's really good, he said. She looked at him. He was funny, she said. People forget to say that. They talk about how much he worked and how big the company was. Nobody really says he was funny. He was funny, Ariana said from where she was sitting on the bank. Her voice was even. She had learned to say it without breaking around it. Isla looked at her. Then she sat down on the bank next to her mother, still holding the dripping rabbit, and leaned against her shoulder in the simple way of a child who had stopped calculating whether comfort was available and had started just taking it. Ariana put her arm around her daughter and held on. Across the creek, Nora was attempting to convince Walt that the correct technique for skipping stones was a wrist thing and not an arm thing, and Walt was listening with the concentrated expression of a man who took all tasks seriously, regardless of their scale. Logan watched them from a few feet away with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he looked like what he was. A man who had ended up somewhere he hadn't planned, and found that it suited him better than any plan he'd made. The wedding was in September. Not in a ballroom, not in anything that required 300 people and laminated programs, and a room that cost more per hour than most people earned in a week. A garden. The rooftop garden of a building near the park, the one with the creek, rented for a Saturday afternoon. 40 people. The ones who had actually been there for the hard parts, which was the only honest guest list. Nora wore the dark blue dress from the gala because she had declared it the best dress and saw no reason not to use it again. She had strong opinions about efficiency. Isla wore something new, pale yellow, her choice, which surprised Ariana because she had expected green. When Ariana asked about it, Isla said she felt like yellow. Ariana said that was a good enough reason. Logan wore a jacket that fit better than the gala one, though Nora had pointed out the improvement with the exacting candor she applied to everything. Ariana wore something simple. She had not planned to cry and did not cry, which was slightly surprising to her, until she saw Logan's face when she walked toward him across the garden, and then she understood that what she felt was too solid for tears, too much like the thing itself rather than a reaction to the thing. There was no ceremony in the traditional sense. They had decided against it, against the production of it, the formal sequence that felt too much like a performance of something they had already been living for months. They stood in front of a civil officiant, they said the words they'd been asked to say, and they signed their names. And then it was done. Isla walked between them on the way back across the garden. She was not crying either. She was holding the yellow skirt of her dress slightly to the side so it wouldn't drag, concentrating on her steps. And she looked more like herself than anyone in that garden had ever seen her look, wholly present, wholly there. Nora came up beside her and said, without ceremony, "Now we're actually sisters." Isla looked at her sideways. "We were already." "I know," Nora said, "but now it's official, like a certification." Isla considered this. "Is there a certificate?" "I'm going to make one," Nora said. "It should have a seal," Isla said. "Official things have seals." "Obviously," Nora said, slightly offended at having to be told this. They drifted ahead of the adults, already deep in the logistics of the certificate, their voices lowering into the conspiratorial register they used when they were planning something that required materials and probably tape. Logan watched them go. Ariana stood beside him and watched too. "You know she's going to involve the actual wax seal kit," he said. "The one Nora got for her birthday." "I know." "We're going to be asked to authenticate it." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you ready for that?" She looked at him. "For a wax seal?" "For all of it." He said it simply, the way he said things that were actually large, simply, without announcing their size. "It's not going to be organized. I'm not organized. Nora's not organized. There's going to be a lot of tape and a lot of card games with constantly changing rules, and I'm still not good at asking for help. And I'm probably going to be too quiet when I should say something, and—" "Logan," she said. He stopped. "I know," she said. "I've been watching for almost a year. I know what it is." She looked at him steadily. "I built a company. I can handle tape." He looked back at her. Something in his face did the thing it had been doing more often lately. The opening, the slight release of something that had been held for a long time under a pressure that no longer needed to be maintained. "Okay," he said. Not yes, not no. "Okay." His word for "I'm in." She had learned to love that word. The foundation completed its first full year with 47 children served across 2 cohorts. 11 of them had been referred by schools who described them as unmanageable. None of the 11 had been asked to leave the program. 3 of them, including Marcus, who had been silent for a month and was now, apparently, somewhat difficult to stop talking, had been identified by their program mentors as potential future mentors themselves. Which was the point. That was always the point. Logan brought this up in a meeting with the board of the foundation, a small board, practical people who cared about outcomes rather than optics, and presented it without framing it as a success story, because he didn't think of it that way. He thought of it as a data point. 3 kids had absorbed enough to potentially give it back to someone else someday. The transmission was working. You kept it working by not getting in the way of it. Ariana watched him present it to the room and thought about the maintenance floor, about a grainy security monitor and her daughter on a plastic crate leaning forward with her chin in her hands, about a man who turned a music box in his hands and said the mainspring had lost its tension, and that when a spring loses tension, it can't do its job. It just sits there, looks fine from the outside, doesn't work. She had not been the spring exactly, but she had understood, standing in that corridor doorway 14 months ago, that something in her had been sitting still inside a machine that looked functional from the outside. And she had watched a stranger, without knowing he was doing it, start winding it back up. There were things she knew now that she hadn't known before this year. She knew that strength was less impressive the more you performed it. That the people who had actually carried heavy things carried them all the way, not just to the place where other people could see them doing it, but all the way to the end. Those people tended to be quiet about it. They didn't need the weight acknowledged. They just needed to put it down eventually. She knew that a child's grief was not a problem to be solved, that treating it like one was not only ineffective, but a specific kind of disrespect. The implication that the feeling was the problem rather than the loss. That what grieving people needed, regardless of their age, was not to be fixed. They needed someone willing to be in the room with them while they figured out how to carry it differently. She knew that asking for help was a skill that deteriorated if you didn't practice it, and that practicing it was more uncomfortable than almost anything else she'd done, and that it was worth the discomfort every time. She knew that the best people she had met in her life, the ones she wanted to be in rooms with, the ones she'd trust with the things that actually mattered, were almost never the ones who made the largest impression when they entered. They were the ones who stayed, who showed up on the 2nd Saturday and the 5th and the 12th, who kept their word even when keeping it cost something, who were honest about their own failures not to seem humble, but because dishonesty about failure was a kind of waste, and they didn't have time for waste. She knew that a 7-year-old girl who everyone had called impossible had not been impossible at all. She had been a person in pain who needed someone to treat her like a person rather than a problem. And that once someone had done that, once Logan had sat on a crate and handed her half a sandwich and not tried to fix anything, she had done the rest herself. Which was how it worked. Which was always how it worked. People were not music boxes. You couldn't replace the spring and wind them up and send them running again. You could only sit with them in the quiet, in the maintenance corridor of whatever floor they'd ended up on, and wait while they found their own way back to what they'd always been capable of. That was the whole of it. There was nothing more complicated than that, and nothing easier. On a Sunday in October, Ariana went down to the building's rooftop garden alone, early, before anyone else was awake. She brought coffee, and she sat on the bench near the eastern edge where the city was visible in all its dense and indifferent sprawl, amber and silver in the early light. She sat there for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just sitting. After a while, she heard the door behind her and then footsteps, and then Logan sat down beside her with his own coffee. Black, no sugar, the same as always. And he looked at the city too, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Below them, somewhere in the building, Nora and Isla were still asleep. They had moved into the same room by choice 3 months ago. A tactical decision driven primarily by Nora's argument that it was more efficient, which Isla had agreed with, and which both adults had found suspicious in a way they chose not to examine too closely. The room was a chaos of notebooks and drawings and card game components in various states of organization and the beetle wax seal kit, which had been used on a number of documents whose legal standing was unclear. It was a good chaos, the kind that meant a space was lived in. "What are you thinking about?" Logan asked. "Nothing," she said. Then, honestly, everything. He nodded. That was enough. The city went on below them, traffic moving, someone's window catching the light, a building crane visible on the western edge turning its slow quarter circle. All of it ordinary. All of it exactly what it was, nothing more, nothing less. A city doing what cities do on Sunday mornings, while the people in them do what people do. Sit with their coffee, watch the light change, stay close to the ones they've chosen. Ariana leaned her shoulder against Logan's. He shifted slightly, naturally, so that the angle worked, and put his arm around her without making a thing of it. They sat like that until the sun was fully up. And then Nora's voice came through the rooftop door. They had not heard her come up, which suggested she had been practicing stealth, which was either Logan's influence or her own initiative, and either way was probably something to monitor, saying, "Isla says breakfast should be pancakes, and I agree, but we need someone to make them." Logan looked at Ariana. Ariana looked at Logan. "You're better at pancakes," she said. "Debatable," he said. "It's really not," she said. He stood up, took his coffee, and went inside. Ariana heard him ask Nora something in a low voice, and heard Nora answer with her usual authority, and then the door swung shut and the rooftop was quiet again. She sat for another moment. The city below her looked the same as it had always looked, the same skyline, the same amber and silver, but she had stopped seeing it as a postcard. It was just the view from where she lived, and that was better. She got up, picked up her coffee, and went inside to her family.